Welcome to Reinforce, and thank you for joining me bright and early so that we can talk about cloud compliance. So, as cloud adoption accelerates, maintaining compliance is becoming more crucial. And here at AWS, we support over 143 security and compliance frameworks. And while in the 15 minutes we have, we won't have time to go through all 143, we're going to talk about how we can leverage AWS native tools and customize them to meet the specific needs of your business. My name is Paige Broderick. I'm a solutions architect here at AWS, and I specialize in cloud governance. So here's a brief overview of what we're going to be talking in today's lightning talk. We're going to start by talking about what the customer challenges are around compliance. Then we'll dive into what the solution we want to create will be. We'll dive into how different AWS services integrate together to create the solution that we're looking for. We'll dive right into the console to actually get a hands-on experience about how these services work and how we can set them up. We'll talk about what our desired endpoint and outcome is. And then we'll talk about next steps and how you can get started with these services and an exciting program that we have to help you get started. So let's talk about what some of the customer challenges are. So according to the Thales Group, 49% of organizations struggle with cloud compliance due to complex regulations and unclear implementation guidance. So as we know, as new laws and regulations come out, the compliance needs to change to meet those new regulations. And then we're also seeing that with emerging technologies like generative AI, our compliance frameworks need to adapt to also encompass those technologies. We also find that a lot of compliance resources are scattered. Customers have to navigate through fragmented documentation, and oftentimes it requires costly external expertise to interpret and implement these compliance frameworks. And last but not least, the dynamic nature of AWS environments demands continuous compliance monitoring, where periodic assessments are no longer good enough. Because compliance frameworks don't directly translate from on-premise to the cloud, we need to have a monitoring system in place to keep up with our constant changes within our AWS environment. So at AWS, how can we solve these challenges? Well, to start, we have pre-built compliance templates through AWS Conformance Packs. An AWS Config Conformance Packs is a YAML template of AWS config rules. And AWS actually has managed sample templates that you can leverage for very common compliance standards like PCI, HIPAA, SIST. And so we can leverage those conformance packs, deploy them within our AWS account, and then your environment will automatically be evaluated against those config rules. We also have a service called AWS Artifact, which is a one-stop shop to find all of your compliance documentation. So you can go into AWS Artifact and you can find the specific AWS compliance documentation, especially when you need documentation about the compliance of the AWS managed hardware. And so we talked about one of the challenges that customers have is maintaining that continuous compliance validation. So with AWS Config, you can actually set up rules to continuously monitor your environment. So as your resources change, you'll get real-time notice about if your environment is compliant or non-compliant. But AWS Config, the rules are binary, right? So it's only going to tell you if a resource is compliant or non-compliant. So to take that one step further, we use a service called AWS Audit Manager, which maps the compliance or non-compliant findings to the actual compliance framework that you're looking for. And with AWS Audit Manager, it's going to give us that automated audit dashboard. So you can log in and you can see a high-level overview of how your compliance, how your AWS environment compliance maps directly to that compliance framework in question. So So let's take a look at what this looks like visually, right? So we have all of our AWS resources right here. AWS has over 200 services. So if a resource is in your account, you can monitor it with AWS Config. So we're going to use AWS Config to evaluate the compliance of our AWS resources. And like we talked about, within AWS Config, we can use AWS Config conformance packs, which is a template of rules, a template of config rules that we can leverage. And AWS has those sample templates that we can leverage. So you don't need to know which config rules are best for the compliance that you're looking for. AWS has sample templates that you can leverage. But like we talked about, AWS Config is binary. It's only going to tell us if the resource is compliant or non-compliant. But we want to know what that maps to in the specific compliance framework that we're looking for. And that's where AWS Audit Manager comes into place. So AWS Audit Manager is going to evaluate the findings from these AWS config rules, and it's going to tell you how your environment is mapping towards that compliance framework, right? So if you're using the HIPAA compliance framework, which is a healthcare compliance framework, then it's going to take the findings from the AWS config conformance pack and map it directly to the HIPAA compliance framework. And you're going to be able to get a detailed view as to which control set within that compliance framework that you're missing. And a lot of customers go through periodic audits from third-party auditors. So AWS Audit Manager has a feature where you're actually able to export that evidence and create an assessment report. And that gets automatically exported to Amazon S3, our object storage service. So that's going to quickly make it so that you're able to take that evidence and you're ready for those audit assessments that your business requires. But that's a lot of talking. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the console. All right, so we're going to start with AWS Artifact. Like we talked about, this is our self-service audit report portal. So as long as you have an AWS account, you're able to see this service. And this is where you're able to pull those compliance reports. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the reports button in the left-hand panel, and that's going to take us to dive into the service and actually search for a report. So here you're able to see the title of the report, the reporting period, the category of report, the series, and then also a description of the report. With the search feature, you're also able to search for a specific report. So in this case, I'm going to search for HIPAA compliance, and it's going to pull up the AWS Customer Compliance Guide, and in the description it says HIPAA. I can download the report straight into my browser, and then I have immediate access into this compliance documentation. Jumping over to AWS Config, we're going to deploy an AWS Config conformance pack. To do so, I'm going to click on Conformance Pack, and then I'm going to click on Deploy Conformance Pack. This is where those sample templates that we talked about are. I actually took the HIPAA sample compliant or conformance pack template, and I edited it to actually add remediation steps. So if a resource is found as non-compliant, all I need to do is click a button, and it's going to remediate that resource. I uploaded my conformance pack to an S3 bucket, so I'm just going to go ahead and deploy that. I'm going to give the conformance pack a name, and then I'm going to be able to deploy that conformance pack. Once that conformance pack is deployed, you're going to get a compliance score. What that compliance score is going to tell you is the number of compliant resources against the total number of resources within your account. If you click into the specific conformance pack by clicking on the title, you're able to see things like the compliance timeline. So over time, how your resources are changing. And then you can see all the rules that have been evaluated as part of that conformance pack. Like we talked about, I added a custom remediation step. So if this specific conformance pack finds unrestricted SSH, I'm able to click on that specific rule. I can learn more about it. I see that the resource type is the EC2 security group. I can see how often it's evaluated. But because I have those remediation steps, I can click on it and I can remediate. And that's going to run a systems manager document in the background, and it's actually going to remediate my unrestricted SSH. But like we talked about, AWS Config rules don't necessarily map to our compliance frameworks. So we're going to create an AWS Audit Manager assessment. We'll give it an assessment name. We can give it a description. And then we talked about that the assessment reports destination. So if we want to create those assessment reports, we're going to choose an S3 bucket for those reports to go into. So I'll choose a bucket. And then this is where we're able to select that specific compliance framework. So for this example, I'm going to select the HIPAA compliance framework so that my AWS Config HIPAA conformance pack maps to that framework. So I'll click on that, then I'll click on next. You're going to choose the AWS account in scope. So if you have AWS organizations, you'll be able to select all of the accounts part of that organization. I only have one account, so I can only choose that one. Then you're going to be able to specify an audit owner, and this is going to be an IAM role that you want to own the audit. So you'll just select the role that you're looking for, and then you'll be able to review and then create that assessment. So AWS Audit Manager does take about 24 hours to initially start collecting that evidence, but luckily for you, this is a video, so we're gonna jump straight to what this is gonna look like. So this is where you're able to see the specific control sets of the compliance framework that you're working with. So this is how we're able to map those AWS config rules directly to Audit Manager, right? So if you want to take a look at what the specific sections are, this is where you can do that. So we're going to open up section 308. You can see the specific control sets. You can see how much evidence has been collected against that control set. And if you click on one of the control sets with evidence that's been collected, you can dive deeper into what that control set is looking for. So it's going to give you a description of what you're looking for. You're going to be able to see the evidence folders and what type of evidence it's collected and from where. And then you're also going to be able to see things like the details, the testing information, the different evidence sources that AWS Audit Manager is leveraging. You can add comments, and then you'll also be able to see a change log of how your services are changing. But we talked about wanting to have that compliance dashboard. So this is where we're able to see that dashboard. You can quickly get an overview of what types of control sets are within that compliance framework. And you can actually hover over the evidence detection to determine how many resources you have are non-compliant versus compliant. So this is going to give you that high-level overview of how your account is doing against that compliance framework. You'll see the daily snapshot, and then you'll be able to hover over all those individual line items. So what is our desired outcome, right? So with AWS Artifact and also with those AWS Config sample conformance packs, we're going to allow you to create a compliance blueprint as a starting point. Then, with AWS Config conformance packs and also AWS Artifact, or AWS Audit Manager, we are going to simplify that monitoring. We're going to have a timeline of how our compliance is changing over time. And then with AWS Audit Manager, you're also going to have that high-level overview in that dashboard to get that quick glance at how your environment is doing. And then with the feature within AWS Audit Manager that allows you to export those assessment results straight into an S3 bucket of your choice, it's going to make it a lot easier for your team to be ready for those audits that your business needs to follow. So I know that was a lot of talking, and I know you all are most interested in how you can actually get started in your own environment. So I highly recommend scanning this QR code to get the workshop. The workshop actually corresponds with the demo that I just went through. So you'll actually get the opportunity to deploy an AWS Config conformance pack, And then you'll also get the opportunity to set up AWS Audit Manager as well. But if that's overwhelming, we're actually running a program called the Cloud Compliance Accelerator, where an account SA will work with you to deploy these services within your account, and then they will set a follow-up meeting about 24 to 48 hours later, where they'll walk through the results with you, and they'll come up with a remediation plan to make sure that you're within the compliance framework or score that you're looking for. So, highly recommend scanning these QR codes. I'll leave them up for a little bit to give everyone time. But that is the end of today's lightning talk. Please, when you have a chance, take time to fill out the survey to let us know how we did, especially if this content was helpful. It'll help us with new sessions. If you want to continue the compliance conversation, I'll be at the New to AWS booth for the rest of the day, and I'm happy to have individual conversations about how we can make sure that your environment is also compliant against the framework that you're looking for. So thank you.